it is entirely reasonable to assert that no more than a handful of people have influenced what Americans think about running than our featured author here this afternoon. Amby Burfoot hails from Connecticut and achieved his greatest competitive acclaim as the winner of the 1968 Boston Marathon. Later that year, he broke the American record in the marathon with a personal best time of 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 28 seconds. His Boston win came while Amby was still an undergraduate at Wesleyan University, perhaps serving as an influence to his roommate, Bill Rogers, later a 4-time winner of both the Boston and the New York City marathons. His influence, however, on the sport was only beginning in his dorm room. Amby followed a brilliant competitive career by turning his energy towards writing about running. Beginning in the 1970s at Runner's World magazine, he has written about running and runners for coming on 4 decades now. Aside from his voluminous work, he has also penned multiple books, and his latest work is entitled First Ladies of Running, 22 inspiring profiles of the rebels, rule breakers, and visionaries who changed the sport of running forever. Some of these names will be familiar even to casual fans of running, such as Joan Benoit Samuelson, who won the first Olympic women's marathon in 1984. Others will be revelatory even to longtime observers of the sport. But all of them have something in common. They were trailblazers in a sport that, as incredible as it may sound to a 2016 audience, frequently did not believe in either their ability or the appropriateness of women as competitive athletes. So how far exactly have women come? Amby will tell you much more, but consider that it was not until 1960 that women were permitted to compete at the Olympic level in any event longer than a 200-meter sprint. The marathon for them came nearly a quarter of a century later. More importantly, today, women are participating in races by the millions, everything from the neighborhood 5K to the 100-mile trail race. The road from there to here was neither flat nor smooth, but now we'll know a little bit more about the women who paved it. Please give a warm Gaithersburg welcome to Amby Burfoot.
I'm a runner, which means in part that I can't stand still, so I'm not going to stay anchored behind that podium. I'll try to move as little as possible. Sometimes I move so much the people in the audience get nauseous. If you have to leave, I'll understand. That's okay. I hate it when the people who introduce me steal half of my topic for themselves and there's nothing left for me. But Paul, that was a wonderful introduction. Anyway, thank you. I want to tell you just a little bit more about myself and how I got here and a little bit more of the background of women's running. And then I do, in fact, want to tell you about some of the women in my book, particularly ones that you probably do not know a lot about. So I've been running since about 1964 or so, 63, I guess. I've run about 110,000 miles in my life. I'm still going relatively strong, which is to say I ran yesterday morning, did an hour of indoor bicycling today. I'll run tomorrow morning. I ran the Boston Marathon a month ago, which was 51 years after my first race at Boston. And what I tell people, the single running achievement that I am most proud of is not winning the Boston Marathon, because, you know, if you train 120 miles a week and have a good day, have a little bit of luck, and have about this much talent, anybody can win the Boston Marathon. But my proudest achievement in running is that for the last 53 Thanksgiving days in a row, 53 consecutive Thanksgiving days, I've finished the same 5-mile road race just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. And yeah, I won it a bunch of times when I was young, and then I won it a bunch of times in the Masters division, and then I disappeared into the wonderful mid-pack 15,000 people who run the race every year. And now nobody cares or knows what I do in that particular race on Thanksgiving Day, except I keep going back, and I keep track, and I've got 53 in a row, and that doesn't take talent and it doesn't take luck. It just takes being damn tough and disciplined and determined. Well, I should say it takes a little bit of luck. We've all been in this life of ours long enough to know that things happen that weren't planned and weren't scheduled and you didn't deserve to have happen to you. And those things come along for all of us. I've had a few of them myself, but fortunately they haven't been so dramatic that I couldn't keep going. So as distance runners and as people interested in living an entirely long, full, active life, it's the year after year of sticking to the goal of lifetime fitness and health and participation, which I think is really, really important, and not what you won and what you didn't win. So that's my major accomplishment in running, I think. I thought today, as I was coming over here, and now as I sit and as I stand and look at all of you seated here, that if we were running a race, if we had a 5K or 10K this morning, we'd all be saying, gosh, this is a great day for running. It's just a terrible day for the spectators. Unfortunately, we're all spectators today. Even I can't go out and run around town, so I hope all of you are warmly enough dressed. I got myself warmly dressed, and if I get too hot up here, I'll strip off a layer or something, but it's wonderful to have you here and to come and listen to some of the stories of the first ladies of running. So we had a little introduction from Paul already, and he really hit it on the nose. As some of you know, in the 1928 Olympics, there was a half-mile run and 800 meters for women. And after that race, one or two of the women looked kind of tired, and one or two of them wiped some sweat off their brow. And it's rumored, but not absolutely proven, that one or two of them collapsed and, lay on the track after the race, which is only what 100% of everybody does after an Olympic race, right? You give it your all, you flop on the track and say, I'm not getting up until they move me off of here. I'm tired. But because it was women who performed the dastardly deed of looking fatigued and sweaty after the race, and because it was all men who controlled the International Olympics and International Track and Field, it was deemed after the 1928 race that this was an inappropriate display. It was inappropriate for the men who were watching horrified while women appeared sweaty and tired in front of them. And of course, as men and elder citizens of the world, they all felt that they had to be protective of these poor women and save them from running as far as a half a mile. So they wiped the half mile off of the Olympic calendar after 1928, and the longest race for the next 32 years was 200 meters. That's one half lap around a track. That's a sprint in anybody's book. That's a sprint. There was not a middle distance race or a distance race for women for 30 years in the Olympics. Finally, in the late 50s, in 58, I believe it was, somebody at the international level came to their senses and said, for the upcoming Olympics in Rome in 1960, we're going to add the 800 meters back onto the calendar. And that is where my book starts, and that is where some of these women start, because suddenly there were people in this country women in this country who had had no horizons beyond the sprint for all of their lives. They wanted to do something else, but they couldn't. Suddenly there was an opportunity for them. The woman on the screen now won the 1958 800 meters for women. You can see what a beautiful runner she is. She is a farm girl from Chardon, Ohio. I don't even know where that is. This is the only woman in my book that I have not met, and so she's the one that I most want to meet. I'm going to tell you one more story about her before I grab the clicker and advance the slide. A month ago, I was at the movies watching the movie about Jesse Owens, the great Olympic champion from 1936. It wasn't a great movie. It was pretty good. It wasn't very popular, so not a lot of you saw it. I don't see too many people saying, yeah, I saw it. Anyway, it was a feature movie about Jesse Owens, and part of it recounted the fact Then in 1934, in one historic afternoon at Ohio State University, he set 4 world records in succession in 4 different races. So, of course, they showed all of these races fictionally. And so we watch as Jesse Owens gets down on his hands and knees before the race, his first 100 meters, and it's a cinder track, of course, and he's got to dig a starting hole for himself. And what you do in the old days is you bring the garden trowel with you to the track. And so I watch as Jesse's digging the hole in front of him on the track, and I'm watching and thinking, no, that's not right. That's not how you dig a starting hole on the track. And I would not have known this except for Grace Butcher telling me that at her first track practice, which was in 1949 for her, she had several careers as an athlete. Her first track practice, she was instructed that the first and most important thing you have to know if you want to be a track athlete is how to dig a starting hole with a garden trowel. And here's what you do. You get down on your hands and knees, and you dig the hole at a 90-degree angle to the direction you're running. You dig it this way, because that gives you a steep incline against the back of your foot from which to explode out of the blocks and run fast. So whoever did the Jesse Owens movie did not fact check how to run very carefully. And I would never have known this except for Grace Butcher telling me. When Grace Butcher was young, she dreamed of being a great miler like the Glenn Cunninghams that she read about. She went to the first track practice and was told there's no half mile. This is 1949 again. So she has to run sprints for a few years, but finally they allow her into the 800 when it's opened up in 58. She wins the first national championship. This is just a real competitive picture of her running probably in 58 or 59, winning. This could be her national championship race. I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, she, along with a handful of other women that I'm going to introduce you to now, went to this very, very pivotal race in 1960. I didn't cover this race overly in the book, as a matter of fact, because the book is much more about marathons, 10Ks, and races that you have run and can relate to. But this 1960 race, half mile at the Olympic trials, really was the door opener, and it really was the first middle distance event for U.S. women to go to. I've got to look at these slides to know what I'm talking about. This is the winner of that race. It's the 60 Olympic track trials. This woman is 16 years old, and you can tell that she's winning the race because she's just a steamroller. She's bigger and stronger than anyone else in the event. Nobody has heard of her. Her name is Billy Pat Connolly, but she went on to have a very, very distinguished career in track and field and athletics. She started as an 800-meter runner because it was a new event, and someone said, go, you can go to the Olympics in the 800. She said, fine, I'll do it. Really, she was a sprinter, hurdler, and all-around athlete. She actually made the Wheaties box. Is this the Wheaties box? No, it's just the Post magazine. It's a magazine cover. As a pentathlete, she went to 2 more Olympics in the pentathlon, doing hurdles, sprints, pole vault, or high jump, I guess this is. Later went on to coach Evelyn Ashford, who was an Olympic gold medalist in 1984, and also married Harold Connolly, a 4-time Olympian for the U.S. in the hammer throw. So she spent her entire career in athletics and track and field of one kind of another, starting with that 800-meter race. This is the woman who would have been Joan Benoit Samuelson, except she was born about 25 years too young, too early. Again, another fantastic picture of a great early female runner in mid-stride. Her name was Doris Brown Heritage. She also went to the race in 1960. I think she finished 5th in that event. She didn't make it to the Olympics, but she was there at the very, very outset. She later made 2 Olympic teams in 72 and 76 when they finally added a 1,500-meter race to the Olympics. This is what she looks like. Great hair, right? This is what a starting shot of her looked like in the early 60s in one of her track races. Well, I said that Doris would have been Joan Benoit Samuelson except for not being born too soon. After her career was over, she had a number of injuries. She began coaching at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle. And she had some young runners on the team, young women milers. And after one track season, they said, you know, we want to go up to Vancouver to run the Vancouver Marathon. Why don't you come and run with us? And Doris had never thought about running a marathon. She was still training steadily. She had great talent, but she had never given it much thought. She said, yeah, sure, I'll go. And so, 5 or 6 women got into a car, drove to Vancouver, slept on the floor of the same hotel room. And the next morning, she lined up in her first marathon, which she had never even thought of running, and ran 2:48. That's what everybody does in their first marathon, right? So she runs 2:48 in her first marathon. The next year, Fred Lebo is organizing the first New York City marathon, the 5-borough marathon. And he's already got a woman in the field named Mickey Gorman, who he's pretty sure will win the race. And she does. She was the best at the mid-70s. But he wants to be able to tell the press that at least he has a competitive field. And the only way he can do that is to invite Doris Brown Heritage to the event. So he calls her up. She says, no, I can't. I'd love to, Fred, but I'm coaching my team that day. We have a track meet all day long on Saturday. Your race is the next day. It just doesn't work out. Sorry. He persists. He keeps calling her back. On about the third call, she says, well, I guess I could coach my team all day long and then take a red-eye from Seattle that night, arrive in New York at 6 o'clock in the morning and run the race, which starts at 10 o'clock. And she does that, and she doesn't run her best time. She runs a 2:51 in her second marathon. She doesn't win it. She finishes second to Mickey Gorman. But being Doris, she went to the press conference and apologized profusely for the fact that she couldn't be more competitive and add more spirit and give Mickey a better battle. One of the most humble and greatest runners in U.S. history. I'm not sure if I've got another picture of her. This was her crowning event. 5 years in a row, Doris won what was then called the International Cross Country Race. And you can see that this one is in the UK or Wales, I believe. You can see they're coming down a hill. They're fording a stream with a little plank. Of course, if it was real cross country, they wouldn't have had the plank. They would have had to wade through the stream. But she won this event 5 times in a row. She was just unbeatable on the international level. She went on to become an Olympic coach in '84 when Joan won the gold medal, and is really still alive, still doing well in Seattle, and really one of the heroes of early American women's distance running. This is another one of my favorites. I have to check the time here. This photo is so good because it's a Time Life photo, which I cadged for today. But she, in 1960, she ran the 800 meters I've been talking about at the Olympic trials, finished way back. She was one of the 18-year-olds. Then she went to run the 5-mile race in Hartford that I told you I've run so many years in a row. And they said, no, it's against the rules. You can't run. We can't let you. I'm sorry. Don't run. And being a nice, polite little girl from Groton, Connecticut, where I now live, she said, okay, I won't run, but how about next year? And they said, yeah, next year, come on back next year, enter early, and we'll let you can run. She comes back next year. This is the next year, 1961. She gets the same treatment. Here the race official is telling her why she can't run because it's not legal for women to run in road races. Another woman, actually 2, have joined her at the last minute to her surprise. So this time she's got to decide whether she's going to be a nice little girl and sit on the sidelines again or not. And of course, the race officials see 3 women, in the race, and that terrifies them. So the big fat guys all link arms and they parade up in front of the start as if that's going to stop them. And the 3 lithe, fit young girls just run around them and take off down the 5-mile course. Not going to let it stop them this time. And Julia runs the course at 7-minute and 20-second pace and finishes ahead of many of the women. She's wearing, and you can see what a good-looking runner she is from this photo. And she was one of the ones, I heard this many times in the book, the women were very conscious of the fact that they couldn't run all out in races because then, in fact, they might look tired and sweaty and collapse. So they saved themselves a little bit so they would look good in races. And Julia looks very good, in my opinion, in this race. Ran 7:20 pace. Of course, they all had the weirdest clothing back then because there just wasn't any clothing. She calls this her college gym tunic. So I like this picture. She was a PhD zoologist, and here she's playing with a rat in front of her classes, telling them about zoology, I guess. Many of the women, I haven't got time to list them, particularly the early women, interestingly, got PhDs, MDs, and had other incredible academic and professional careers. Julia was so incredible that after 20 years of being a zoology teacher with her PhD, said, I'm a little bored, I think I'll try something else. And went to medical school in her mid-50s and got her MD and practiced psychiatry for the last 20 years of her professional career. And then, of course, 50 years after her first race in the gym tunic, she came back in the same gym tunic and did it again in 2011, and I had the pleasure of running with her that day because this is my annual race. And she proved that women can not only do it once, but they can come back and do it again 50 years later. This, of course, is Bobby Gibb finishing the Boston Marathon in 1966. Many of you read the stories about Bobby in the last month or two, which I wrote and many other people wrote. Thank goodness. Again, you see she's wearing her brother's Bermuda shorts. She's wearing a black bathing suit on the top. The story of this race is that she tried to enter. They said, this is the Boston Marathon, which was how you measured yourself as a runner in the 60s. She tried to enter. They said, no, women can't run. They're not allowed to. She's a very artsy, ethereal, non-confrontational woman, not a confrontational bone in her body, but this just riled her up. And so what did she do? She got on the bus in San Diego where she was living. I told you the story about the overnight red eye. Got on the bus in San Diego, took the bus 3.5 days to Boston, got there the night before the race, ate too much food because her mother put a lot of food in front of her, put on her brother's clothing, went out to the start and hid in the bushes. She literally thought, and this is very hard to imagine, she literally thought that if she showed up as a woman who wasn't allowed to register, that she might be arrested. She thought if the police spotted her, she might be arrested. If the race officials saw her, they would refer her to the police and she might be arrested. Hid in the bushes, jumped into the middle of the men. The men all said, this is great, we love you. We always loved having women in the races. As I always say, I was, a nerdy, dorky, four-eyed, skinny, good-for-nothing runner. So any attractive women who wanted to come run a race with me, I was all for it. I couldn't get a date to save my life. So it was great having women in the races. She finishes in 3:21 ahead of literally 2/3 of the Boston Marathon field. Just another picture of her, if you can see it, kind of beaming at the finish. I tracked down this guy when I was writing my story. He had died a year or two ago. But his children told me about, just before this race, he converted to the Baha'i faith, about which I know very little, but they long ago preached equality between the genders. And he dropped out of this race. He had a bad day, but was so excited when he heard that a woman had run that he found her and came by and congratulated her and wanted to make sure she received her due. My favorite running photo of all time, Bobby Gibb on the right-hand side of the road, running strongly the last mile of the Boston Marathon. These are the guys who dropped out. We called this the meat wagon. They didn't have a bus in those days. These are the guys in the meat wagon. They're like lying there puking in the back of the wagon. Somebody suddenly says that there's a woman on the road, so they all lift up their heads, and imagine how great they felt about dropping out on that day. I got to move ahead quickly. This is Roberta at 73 on the cover of a running magazine a month or so ago. Still running, still looking good. Not fast. None of us are fast any longer. But she has totally the spirit of a runner. Love this little photo. Hoosier. This is Cheryl. I'll tell you, Cheryl Bridges from Indiana. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a moment. This is at a cross-country race in Boston in 1967. Her coach had driven her from Indiana to Boston, put her on the starting line, and she was like, practically peeing in her pants. She was so scared. She'd never been to a national meet. She had no idea if she could run with the good runners who were there, but she hung out. She did what her coach said, and she finished like 5th in the race. She had a tremendous race. She later, against the obstacles that all women face, was the first woman to break 2:50 in the marathon. She set a world record. She ran 2:49 in 1971, I believe. If she had had Olympic opportunities in the 70s in the marathon, which was the distance she was good at, she needed to run more than a mile. She might have actually made it to the Olympic team, but she, of course, didn't have those opportunities. Thank goodness she was out there. She stuck with it. And she had a daughter named Shalane Flanagan, who's been to 4 Olympics in a row for the U.S. in the 10,000 meter and the marathon. And there's mother and daughter talking at after the World Championships a year or two ago. I've got to move now. Women are finally allowed to run the Boston Marathon officially in 1972. The women's winner this year is Nina Kusik, who's wearing the polo shirt and whatever boys' gym shorts she found from one of her kids or something probably. This is Catherine Switzer, who was famous from a few years earlier, when she got bulldozed by Jock Semple. This was actually 67. This, of course, is the photo seen round the world, literally seen round the world. Bobby Gibb had won Boston the year before, was the first woman. The next year, Bobby Gibb shows up, wins Boston again. Catherine finishes 40 minutes behind her, but she gets attacked by the race official, Jock Semple. She happens to have a boyfriend who's a 250-pound hammer thrower. So he crushes Jock, a good one, and Catherine survives, and to her credit, then makes promotion of women's running her life work. Works with the Avon International Group, starts marathons in 6 different countries, which is what the Olympics requires before they put you into the Olympics. So she's one of the ones who helped get women's marathon into the Olympics. An important note, people think that Jock is got some kind of issue with Catherine Switzer. He doesn't care about Catherine Switzer at all. He wants the damn number, because you're not allowed to have an official number because that makes you look like an official runner in the race. So he didn't want to beat her up. He just wanted to rip the number off of her chest. And, of course, they became good friends afterwards, and she used him in many of her promotions for women's running. This is Charlotte Lettuce, a friend of mine who won the mini marathon in Central Park, the first big all-women's race. How am I doing? And she was one of the great runners in the mid-'70s. This is Joan Benoit. Now we're moving forward to closer to the climax. Joan, of course, this is her 1979 Boston Marathon win. Here she's wearing her Bowdoin University college shirt. Somebody handed her a Boston Red Sox cap, so she's got that on backwards on her head. She came out of nowhere, seemingly, to win this race in '79, became the great New England and then eventually world favorite in the marathon for all of her wonderful qualities, not the least of which are running excellence, humility, environmental protection, putting on races in Maine, etc. Everyone's seen this photo of her winning the Olympic marathon. I was lucky enough to be in the journalism stands that day, and we are supposed to be objective bystanders of the sport, but virtually all of us were wiping tears off our cheeks when Joan strode so strongly into the stadium that day. Here she is, a little bit more recent, near her home in the famous Beach to Beacon road race, which she now promotes in Maine. This is one of those races which, if you get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and happen to hit the right 20-second period, you can get registered for it. Otherwise, it closes out faster than you can do anything. And she, of course, is on the cover of my book, which we'll have out here shortly. I wanted to do a couple more women. I got to run a marathon with Oprah Winfrey down the road in Marine Corps in 1994. It's a long, long story. I was in town just to give a talk like this one. We found out that Oprah's running. I'm like, hey, I'm the editor of Runner's World. This is the most famous person who's ever run the marathon. I guess I better get out there and run it with her. So I waited at the 3-mile mark in the Pentagon parking lot, jumped in with her, and followed for 23 miles. And truly the bravest, most courageous marathon I've ever seen anyone run. I'll tell you why briefly in a moment. She had other onlookers also, mainly 2 guys from the National Enquirer in red who had been flown in the night before from LA and Miami, along with 6 photographers on motorcycles. The National Enquirer was hoping something dreadfully horrible would happen to Oprah during this race. They were good guys. They were runners. They actually knew who I was. At one point they said, hey, Oprah, there's a Boston Marathon winner running behind you. So she slowed down, reached back, shook my hand, and then somebody, the National Enquirer, sent me the photo later. But she was every inch of the way. Other runners were pounding her on the back saying, we love you, we're so glad you're here, it's great to have you, you're an inspiration, all this wonderful stuff. In the early miles, you know, she's trudging along, trying to acknowledge people and wave back to them and whatnot. But as you can imagine, as the miles dragged on, as she got more and more tired, the attention was not welcome. She didn't have the energy to acknowledge anyone. When she got to the mall and there were tens, if not hundreds of thousands of fans all like yelling in her face, it was really, really quite overwhelming. But she trudged on. She got the job done. We put her on the cover of Runner's World about 5 months later. I thought I would be in danger of losing my job because there were no readers of Runner's World who were African American women. I thought maybe we wouldn't sell a single copy of the magazine, and it was the best-selling issue in the history of the magazine on newsstand. And I believe the reason is that people could relate to Oprah, and this actually became a rallying cry. Oprah did it, so can you, or Oprah did it, I should be able to do it also. And 10 years after Joan Benoit Samuelson won the Olympic marathon, which was a wonderful, wonderful achievement, nothing happened in women's running. As soon as Oprah ran, that was the beginning of the women's running boom in the mid-90s. Nobody can prove, it's just a correlation, but it seems to me none of us really believe, not too many of us think we're going to go on to win the Olympic marathon, and it's really in the cards for us to run 120 miles a week. But if Oprah can do it, probably you can do whatever you'd like to also. This woman, Marilyn Bevins, visited us just down the road at the Fleet Feet store last night. She was the first black female marathoner in the U.S. in the mid-'70s, and she is one of the 22 in my book. She had no role models whatsoever. There were very, very few black men running. There were no black women at all. She grew up in Baltimore, a very fierce, quiet, independent woman who got herself, who actually won a couple of races in the state. She won what was called the Maryland Marathon. Then it became the Baltimore Marathon. Now it's gone through lots of iterations since. But she got down to 2:49 in the marathon and really stands at the starting line for black women to be distance runners in this country. And I knew Marilyn in the 70s because we were both running the Boston Marathon. I hadn't seen her for 40 years, literally, until last night. And it's funny, old runners, you just start telling stories and you catch up and you feel like you've had 40 years together running morning workouts 3 times a week. And this is a photo of Marilyn that Runner's World recently took, the kind of little story that honored her contributions. She's still coaching in Baltimore. She's still saying, you know, nobody ever stepped forward to coach me in the 70s. I'm not exactly sure why. All the other women had coaches. I didn't. maybe I could have been better. I sort of wonder if I could have been better. I don't ever want anyone else to not have a coach and have to wonder if they could be better. So she is still coaching, even though she's retired from real work in Baltimore in the school system. I think that's everything. I just want to say that when I started looking at the possibility of writing this book, I did the internet research like everyone. I assumed the book had already been written. It's such an obvious title to tell today's women runners and the rest, runners for all time, about what it was like for the early ones. It hadn't been written, and since I knew almost all of them, not closely, but I knew them, they knew me, we had a empathy and a feeling for each other. It was a little bit of a challenge, but a great thrill and a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to tell their stories. I don't think I have to tell any of you here. I'll tell you this. I ran my first Boston Marathon in 1965, and there were this many women in the field. Bobby Gibb was the next year. So in my lifetime, in just a generation or two, what has happened in women's running is just unbelievable. We've gone from 0% of the field to, as you know, the number of women runners now in races goes from 40% in some marathons to 60% in half marathons. It's easily the biggest and best and healthiest for the sport and for society movement in the 50 years that I've been in running. And I believe the population-wide significance is very, very important too. I don't have to tell anyone about the obesity issue and the healthcare crisis related to that. I don't have to tell anyone how important women are in establishing standards to fight against that, especially for their children and their extended families. So I think women runners, while they started out as a small fraction of the field, have now become 50% and more, and are not only welcomed by everybody, I hope, in running, but also extraordinarily important all across the scale, every distance, every race, every age group. It took a while, but we got to where we always wanted to be, and so it's thrilling to have so many women running with us now, and it's very, very nice of all of you to come out and listen to my stories this afternoon. Thank you very much. Are we good? Should I do a couple of questions? We've got 5 minutes, so I could take a couple of questions if any of you have them. Yes. Yeah, that was very, very hard one for me to work on. The question is, what about women runners around the world? This is pretty much an American book, so I did focus on U.S. women. I put Greta Weitz in the book because she won New York City so often. She seemed like a U.S. citizen. I left off some women who could have been in the book, put them in the back, but I didn't feature them because they were from usually Australia or New Zealand, had a lot of tremendous runners in the 70s. Worldwide, I think U.S. women have unquestionably led the way, particularly for participation. And now we're beginning to see it in cultures where it was very, very slow. Japanese women were always great at the front end. They've won a lot of Olympic medals in the marathon, but there was not much participation. Now there is. No one even knows what's going on in China. I mean, as with everything in China, it's happening so fast that you can't even keep up with the count. But I keep on hearing about people running in China, shoe companies establishing themselves in China, races growing in China, and I'm sure the Chinese women are going to be a real influence on the world. They have been in the past, sometimes probably under weird coaching and drugs, but I think they're going to be very strong in the future. Let's try one more question. Yes? Yeah, I have opinions about the Russian athletes. They have to be prefaced by the fact that none of us know anything. The problem with all of the doping stuff is nobody literally knows anything. Everybody's got an opinion, but it becomes almost worthless. My problem with the Russian women, not just right now, but for the last several decades, is that they've done very, very well in women's marathoning, have won a lot of medals and a lot of money, taken money away from other women. At a time when the Russian men are complete dog meat. The men can't do a thing. The women are winning medals and running very fast. I don't know of any other cultures where only the females are good and the males aren't, whether it's US, Kenya, or Ethiopia. Something's been fishy in Russia for a number of years, and I can only hope that we do get to the bottom of it and it does get cleaned up. I think the threat of doping is really deep now, and designer drugs, which I know nothing about, but we all imagine what could be going on in places. And we do have to acknowledge that there is now money in the sport, nothing like the professional sports, the big ones, basketball, baseball, and everything else. But there is money in the sport, and that the amounts of money can mean quite a bit to people from countries that aren't as established and don't have economies as we do. So let's keep our fingers crossed. 1 30-second one. A female shoe company. I'm not sure if anyone has done that. I feel like Rika might have been female-owned. I think it's a great idea. The only thing holding them back is, can you imagine the investment it takes to take on Nike and New Balance and everybody else? But it's a great idea. Women are, a huge part of the market now, and they do tend to support women-specific products. So if I had several $1 billion and had a good friend, a female friend who was a businessman, I'd encourage her. Again, thank you so much for coming out today.